What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Fallout 4, which is a video I've been meaning to make for quite some time for a variety of different reasons, really, but most recently I would say things like the next-gen update, all the buzz around the show from earlier this year, etc. has had me keen on jumping back in myself, but also, for those who may be unaware entirely, all the way back in 2015 when I started my channel, Fallout 4 was one of the first games I covered, and I did a lot of, I would say, very silly stuff with it. And to put that in perspective, it took me about 6 years before I started doing this full-time in 2021. But despite that, technically speaking, Fallout 4 was my very first review. And to describe that review in a word, I would use terrible. So I've been meaning to actually add it to my catalog of, I would say, actual reviews, if anything else, which would give me an opportunity to talk about it, obviously, to a bigger audience, but also discuss how I feel about the game. And while, sure, I'm probably not going to tell you anything about Fallout 4 you don't already know, but never discount a YouTuber's ability to hear themselves talk. And to that end, my general opinion about Fallout 4 is basically that it's a game of highs and lows. There are parts of Fallout 4 that I think are genuinely fantastic, things like Far Harbor, for instance, or even Survival Mode, which shows that just with a few small tweaks to the base game formula, you have this really incredible experience. Now, unfortunately, a lot of those great moments are peppered in with moments that are really, really bad. Like telling the Railroad repeatedly how you don't think synths are human at all, you totally agree with the Institute and would prefer them over the Railroad, essentially laughing in their face, and at no point do they ever do anything about it until the story decides it's finally time to commit to that path, which comes towards the very end. And I point that out specifically because in a lot of ways, I would say Fallout 4 actually mimics a lot of what worked about Fallout New Vegas, with a primary difference. And that difference is Fallout 4 is a game that seems to be afraid to let you commit to a decision, and as a result, a lot of moments wind up falling flat, which is a real shame in a game where you have real moral quandaries like letting a child die or saving your character, and not only that, but actively living with a debuff for the rest of the game. And while yes, you could game your way around and avoid that, from just a simple quest and gameplay perspective, that's a really compelling choice. And yeah, sure, truth be told, I wish the debuff was a little stronger than it was, but at a glance, that's a neat idea. But it's wild to me that most of the decisions in the game like that typically get relegated to side content rather than like the main story or factions, which is where Fallout 4 is at its weakest. But in spite of that, I also think it has a fantastic sandbox, a ton of interesting locations to run around, some DLC I really enjoy, so as you might imagine, like many people, I have a lot of opinions about Fallout 4, and I actually have a fair few opinions about the rest of the series at this point as well, because as a CRPG guy, I've definitely reviewed 1 and 2 before, 3 very recently, and New Vegas a little farther back when I was still kind of finding my feet, but I think it still stands up. In case you're curious about my thoughts on the rest of the series as a whole. But regardless of my opinion, or yours really, I would say Fallout 4 was really a double down on the genre shift from those original CRPGs beyond just the literal transition from isometric to first or third person. Because Fallout 4 sees a huge change to progression systems and things like that, and while they've backed off on some of those changes, more recently with even a game like Starfield, which has more RPG mechanics, 4 here really did try to move away from a lot of that by translating it into a different system entirely, which obviously we'll get into. But first, a note on the technical state. Now, I mentioned that next-gen update earlier, which came out much earlier in the year, and unsurprisingly, that update wound up breaking a bunch of people's mods, and as a result, their modded save files, which means when that update happened, people dealt with no small amount of technical issues, because frankly, they weren't expecting an update to a game that came out in 2015. So if you're going to have problems with this game, it's likely something to do with that. And while we'll talk about mods momentarily, another big thing to know really is that even outside of that, you're still prone to running into some other issues as well. Now, most of these other ones are relatively small in number and frankly scope, but nonetheless, problems do indeed persist to this day. Personally, just in gathering the footage for this review, I dealt with a whole host of audio issues, like lines of dialogue kind of getting layered over one another for some reason, the audio just cutting out entirely, and weird stuff like that. And then there's the, I would say, almost traditional Bethesda issues of things like clipping and small glitches where items will just move through others in ways that they definitely shouldn't. So while the game is far from unplayable, it's not impossible by any stretch that you will encounter some sort of issue. To that end, there is a mod, or a method perhaps of downgrading the game back to its pre-next-gen version, which might help you with compatibility in terms of various mods you may or may not want to use at this point. But because of that next-gen update and how it interacts with mods and what it means for them, if you're going to have issues, more than likely it's going to be something in that specifically. But to that end, let's actually talk a little bit about mods. So I don't think you could really talk much about a Bethesda title at all without mentioning the impacts mods can have. As Fallout 4 is one of their biggest games, there are mods for basically anything and everything in every size and shape. This year we saw the release of a total conversion via Fallout London. There's the very popular Sim Settlements and a host of other things that are fantastic in a lot of ways. They change your gameplay experience fundamentally or alter things in ways that might make them more fun for you, but for a review, those things don't really do much. So this is completely unmodded in what I'm doing here. I've talked about this previously, but what I'm taking a look at is the game itself and not what it could be via mods. With that in mind, though, I did have some Creation Club stuff installed. Some of it, I believe, got bundled into the next-gen update, but I've also claimed a few free ones apparently here and there over the years. So the Creation Club, or Bethesda's paid mods more or less, allows you to buy and spend credits on those mods, as I'm sure many people are aware. And generally my take on most of them is that they tend to be very overpriced in terms of what you're getting, which is a problem that plagues us to this very day with Starfield's Creation Club. So while I'm fine with the practice, my big issue with it tends to simply be the price in most cases. Now with that out of the way, somewhat uniquely for a Bethesda title, we now need to talk about difficulty. So difficulty, in my opinion, usually isn't worth mentioning too much in Bethesda titles outside of a few select instances. You can adjust it, it largely affects how easy it is to kill enemies, and we see that system here in Fallout 4. But much like Skyrim has some interesting difficulty modifiers, and Starfield's more recent embrace of my preferred method of a fully modular difficulty, Fallout 4 does have something we need to talk about here, and that is simply survival mode. Survival mode is a completely optional mode that changes Fallout 4 into essentially a different game entirely. It's actually crazy how different this game feels, but again, that just further points out that if you make some small tweaks to the base formula, Fallout 4 constantly has the potential to have just incredible moments. And survival mode really is the highlight of that. Now, you can activate survival mode whenever, but once you turn it off on a given save file, you'll never be able to activate it again without the use of console commands. But the reason that survival mode makes such a huge impact to this game is just because of how substantially it changes the game mechanics. So right away, you can't save the game, you cannot fast travel, ammo and things like that that are typically weightless have weight now. You gain access to a whole host of diseases and injuries your character might pick up and have to deal with, which means you can only really save the game by sleeping, and everything you do really has to be thoroughly planned out because you're going to deal with enemies that are much stronger on a much more regular basis, while you yourself are going to be much easier to kill. As I mentioned, you can catch all sorts of diseases. You have to take after your character's basic health needs like eating and drinking. If you're not careful, that can make you sick though, and then you have to deal with that. You can go see a doctor to cure these, which is what you have to do for injured limbs. They won't just slowly go away after a little while. And to top it all off, survival mode even disables the console commands. Now, you're not completely lost though, because for starters, experience from enemies is doubled, which is a very substantial increase considering how much XP you get largely from killing enemies in this game as it is. But what's more, for I believe it's every 5 enemies you kill, you gain a stack of adrenaline, which gives you a huge increase to your damage, up to a cap of like 50%, I believe. Meaning that if you go slow, plan your routes, figure out your inventory weight and what you're going to carry, especially in relation to the game's junk and how that interacts with like settlements and stuff and how their inventory even has changed, you suddenly have this really incredible survival-oriented experience that a lot of actual survival games can't compete with. Like I mentioned, it kind of feels like playing a different game entirely almost. And I would encourage people to simply check that mode out and see everything it has to offer, because it really is something special. That said, to keep things moving along, I did want to give a brief shout out to the game's cosmetic character creator, because while none of this stuff really has much of an effect on the game itself, you can either create some absolute monstrosities or using the sculpt feature, which will allow you to actually physically sculpt individual pieces of the character's face, recreate some very highly detailed models. In fact, I remember from when this game came out and I was covering it then, you would often see like videos and things of people recreating celebrities' faces and stuff. So while I would say Fallout 4 is starting to look a bit dated for sure, the cosmetic character creator does have its moments. Now that brings us to the story setup and my thoughts on it, which is where we're going to talk about obviously the main plot and the factions for the game. Now I can't imagine you watched a video like this expecting to avoid spoilers, especially after all these years, but just for the sake of saying it, I guess, yes, we're going to get into spoilers here. Now the main story in particular and how it interacts with the various factions of the game tends to be what I enjoy the least about Fallout 4. I think a lot of it is neat in concept, but typically fails to live up to its potential, which causes it to underwhelm regularly. Now, I think the game has a strong start. It shows you and your significant other, either Nate or Nora, depending on who you picked, enjoying that time before the bombs dropped, only to have them drop and interrupt that while you escape to a vault, which turns out to be a cryo chamber. I actually think that's a great opening start to the game and kind of gets you into the feel of it right away and how horrifying much of that would have been. And in fact, despite how much I generally don't like much of the story, one thing I do think Fallout 4 does extremely well is highlighting some of the horrors of that, like some of the holotapes and things you can find from before the bombs falling have some impressively haunting voice acting, but that's neither here nor there. So while you are in cryostasis, you get briefly woken up only to see some odd-looking people kidnap your child who was taken to the vault with you and execute your spouse. You then get refrozen before waking up again, where the game officially kicks off with you on the lookout for your child or your son. And that forms the bulk of the main story, is simply looking for your son. This is going to lead you to all of the game's 4 factions, which we're about to talk about, but the first of which is likely going to be the Minutemen, who will direct you to Diamond City, where you can then find Nick Valentine, who puts you on the trail of Kellogg, the man who actually kidnapped your son, before you chase him down to Fort Hagen for a confrontation, which is where you learn for sure that the Institute has your son. And through Kellogg's brain and a bizarre memory sequence, we learn that we can track down a man named Virgil who escaped to a place called the Glowing Sea, a radioactive hell, and from him we learn how to get into the Institute, which involves teleportation, which we need to interact with one of the factions to actually use to get into the Institute to discover that it wasn't just a few moments since our son was stolen from us when we awoke in the cryopod, but rather another 60 years. Our son is not only grown, but an old man. And not just any old man, the leader of the Institute, the Commonwealth's boogeyman. The people who have been stealing people in the night, replacing them with their synthetic humanoids known as synths, which are largely indistinguishable from regular humans. And it was none other than your son who let you out of the cryopod, basically just to see what would happen, as he describes it. And then this leads to the showdown between all of the different factions, as they all have their own goals, but it pretty much culminates in either siding with the Institute or one of the 3 other factions and destroying the Institute. So while there are multiple endings, a lot of them are essentially the same ending, just slightly different, with us determining the ultimate fate of the wasteland, though, as a result. Now, despite that very quick rundown, I want to hone in on a few specific things, because as I mentioned, you can't really interact with that story too much without interacting with the factions themselves. They're very closely tied to the main story. In fact, the bulk of Fallout 4's main content that isn't DLC, is directly tied to the main story in some way through these factions. And before we talk about them individually, the thing I want to highlight there is that as a result of this, Fallout 4 seems to be afraid of letting you commit to any one of these factions for fear of presumably seeing you lose out on content. Combine that with hit or miss factions in and of themselves and their very flawed way of thinking about things generally, some of which is intentional, some of which I don't think is, and you get a story that is so afraid of having the player deal with consequences that a lot of it just falls really, really flat. So speaking for myself, I think if they were to make the character have to deal with the fallout of those choices, it would have been a better game overall, or at the very least a better RPG. And a lot of that is the way I feel because I actually don't think the overall story of Fallout 4 is that bad, especially in concept. It's just that execution leaves a lot to be desired. As an example, towards the end, you find out that one of the reasons that your son released you from cryostasis is that he has cancer. He knows he's going to die, and he's trying to prepare what he can for the future. So whether you side with the Institute or the other 3 factions, one way or another, despite your entire journey being about finding your son, you are going to lose him. His life has come to its end. And having to deal with just the trauma of that entire situation while also dealing with all of the problems that are ongoing in the wasteland has the ability to be really compelling if the game would just let you make a decision without undercutting it at every turn. And then, towards the end of the game, when it finally does let you commit to a decision, all of it leads to pretty much the exact same place anyway, as most of the endings are almost identical. So speaking for myself at least, I think a way to just dramatically improve Fallout 4's story really would have been to just force you into working with one faction much earlier, and maybe somewhere along the line through that, once you've learned what that faction entails and, maybe they embody some ideals you don't like, as pretty much all of them do, give you the opportunity to sort of off-road yourself from that to the more backup-related option, as that would have been pretty much on par with what New Vegas has you do. Especially considering that these games share so much of a basic core otherwise, in terms of their narrative structure, I mean. And then to go on to have this very same game deal with situations like that better inside content where you can actually deal with a moral quandary that has choices and consequences is just a very jarring experience. But to really dial in on that, we have to talk about the factions individually and what they're all about and their flaws. Now, the very first one you'll almost certainly meet is the Minutemen. Unless you go out of your way to avoid them, you're likely to stumble across them first, just naturally because of where they're placed. The Minutemen are effectively a fallen faction when you find them. They were largely destroyed by the Gunners, but they were effectively a common militia for the area that would respond to settlements to help out with super mutants and any other irradiated monsters that show up to attack basically anywhere. They had a lot of respect for this, but over time they simply fell to basic corruption and then, were just straight up pushed out by the Gunners. So in order to side with the Minutemen, you have to effectively restore them. They name you general pretty much immediately, but then that general title ultimately winds up meaning absolutely nothing, so I think that's a dumb choice. Possibly a commentary about meaningless titles in the Wasteland, though, I suppose. But then from there, the Minutemen is really just all about establishing outposts and getting into the game's settlement system, which we will talk about here before too long. Now, once you've helped them out a bit, you'll eventually retake their prior main base called the castle, and once you're there, you can establish artillery guns that will give you covering fire basically anywhere on a map where you throw the smoke grenades as long as you're in range of a settlement. Which is a pretty neat idea, but faction-wise, that's pretty much all the Minutemen have going on. Now, the issue, I would say, here really is that the Minutemen are outmatched and outgunned on basically every front. They've also been infiltrated by the Institute already because they have basically no defense against that sort of thing. And while I would argue the Minutemen are probably the best option for the Commonwealth overall, I think it's naive to think that they would stand any actual chance, at least against the Brotherhood or the Institute, which are much more well-armed, not least of which, though, because as Preston Garvey might tell you, another settlement needs your help, because these people seem incapable of helping themselves. Now, on the flip side of that, though, we have the equally useless, but presented slightly better Railroad. The Railroad are people that believe the synthetic humans made by the Institute are in fact people that deserve freedom in, obviously, a way that is presented to look like slavery, because that is effectively what it is. But where you fall with the Institute and the Railroad is going to depend largely on whether or not you think Institute synths are in fact people or not. The problem there, though, is that the Railroad is almost laughably stupid in every sense. So first of all, to find the Railroad, you have to find their hideout, which involves walking the Freedom Trail and discovering the password to their hideout once you discover its location, which is literally Railroad. And coming from a faction that just recently had to move to this new headquarters because their previous headquarters, called the Switchboard, got raided by the Institute, is showing a startling lack of basic security. And given how you get introduced to them is them showing this big show of force, effectively, about how they can definitely kill you, and then give you 20 questions about whether or not you think synths are human or not. But the thing is, you can just straight up tell them right here that you think the Institute is right, synths are just machines, and they won't do anything about it. They'll just be like, think about it, I guess. And that's really dumb from a faction that was just attacked by these people. And that's to say nothing of the silly code signs or code names even. And it's just an entire faction that comes off incredibly childish and unrealistic. And the funniest part about that is that ideologically, I get where they're coming from. Personally, in this situation, synths are effectively human at this point. They're exhibiting free will, etc. To me, as an individual, I would see them as people. And yet, the Railroad is so laughably bad, I can't side with them, just fundamentally. Not to mention because they will save synths at the expense of absolutely everyone else. And given that one of their solutions to saving these synths is to wipe their memory out and basically make them an entirely different person, assuming the process even works in the first place, to say the railroad is somehow morally good is also false in my opinion. So you have all these narrative moments that don't make any sense, and then just as a faction, their entire ideology and methodology just don't work, and I really don't like them as a result of that. Now, third up, outside of the Institute, we have the Brotherhood of Steel. The Brotherhood of Steel are honestly incredibly cool visually. I love their power armor, and maybe it's just the part of me that was in the army myself. I really enjoy everything the Brotherhood of Steel has got going on, but that doesn't change the fact that they are effectively tyrants who think they have the right to control all of the technology at the expense of everyone else because they know better than you. So they've got plenty of their own moral flaws, but they've at least got the firepower to back up what they want to do, and that's the point of these guys, at least in Fallout 4. You know, their depiction changes depending on what game you're playing and who's leading them at the time, so things change and there are internal squabbles that make it even more interesting, but all of that strikes me as actually pretty realistic. That happens in real life all the time. But again, the issue here is that you have this incredibly militaristic faction that has the firepower to back it up, who regularly sees you working with other factions and will even comment on it on occasion, and yet they choose to do nothing to you as a result of that. I feel like these people would be the first ones to shut you down, which is, I think, shown when one of their best turns out to be a synth, Dance, and they take a pretty hardline stance against that, but you can walk in there with Nick Valentine with zero consequences. So again, just amazing highs and incredible lows. Now, somewhat ironically, when you get to the actual Institute, I think the Institute is almost identical to the Brotherhood, but just in reverse. They also seem to think they know best for everyone else. They are guilty of kidnappings, murders, completely unethical experiments, and while they claim to be doing that to push humanity forward, let's be honest, it's just for their own hubris. And we can see examples of that in-game when the Commonwealth tried to set up its own actual government and the Institute went out of their way to murder everyone involved. So this faction is almost cartoonishly evil to the point where it undermines their own goals half the time. Now obviously the Institute doesn't think the synths they make are actually human and their recall codes and things work and shut these things down to essentially a machine-like state again, and they absolutely treat the synths like slaves. So when you put all of that together, every main faction of this game is wildly flawed. Some of that is intentional. Every single one of these factions has a commitment to their mission that is so overzealous that it makes huge flaws in their approach. The Brotherhood has largely abandoned any pretense and just become straight up zealots. The Institute is willing to do basically anything to anyone if it furthers their own goals. The Railroad has an admirable mission, but is laughably incompetent. And the Minutemen are probably the best overall, but realistically lack the force to actually be a realistic choice here. So all of that is fine and dandy. I think you could chalk a lot of that up to simply the framing. But the issue for me with the factions in particular comes in when you start talking about how they are written and how they seemingly ignore everything the player does, despite showing these extreme, zealous opinions basically everywhere else. And it gets to a point where it just doesn't make a lot of sense narratively. And because these factions are so tied into the main story with you being required to work with them at some point, it comes up a lot, which means that despite the fact that each of these factions have things about them that I like and have like goals and everything that makes sense, it's just that they are written in such a way that it almost seems very silly to wind up choosing any of them. And I think a lot of that could have been fixed by simply forcing the player to commit to one of these paths and factions after you've met all of them, perhaps, which might have taken, reworking the Railroad's entry because them showing you all this firepower only to be like, oh, this guy loves the Institute. Well, that's fine, I guess. Doesn't make any sense. And I tell you all that to basically say that it's really frustrating, for me at least, to see this really interesting core of an experience be brought down by everything surrounding it and how it approaches letting the player do essentially whatever they want, consequence-free, in a way that just doesn't make sense in the story that is being told, which, like I mentioned, is the reason for those highs and lows. But that does finally bring us to the progression portion of the video, talking about the various systems at play to allow you to define your character the way you would prefer. Now, personally, I'm much more of a fan of traditional RPG systems here as opposed to Fallout 4's perk system, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't still enjoy it. There's a lot of different ways to build a character in Fallout 4. In fact, you can do some really fun stuff thanks to DLC that lets you build robots, and you can then tie that into a build that is effectively about a super smart guy who builds robots to defend himself, and then you can take perks to buff those robots, hack other robots mid-combat, etc., so where your character isn't even necessarily directly involved in all the firefights. You could even go fully into luck, which gives you a bunch of really, really strong perks that can even cause enemies to kill themselves when they are attacking you, as an example. So while I admit Fallout 4 has moved away from the RPG systems in this series previously that I enjoyed much more, they did do a lot of fun stuff with what they changed it to. But let's talk about that more specifically. So right at the beginning of the game, we're going to pick our special stats: strength, perception, endurance, constitution, intelligence, agility, and luck as normal. Now, one other change Fallout 4 makes that I actually liked a lot is that it is very difficult to create a maxed out character in this game. Whereas in almost all of the other games, it's pretty easy to do that. In fact, you might do it just straight up accidentally. Whereas in Fallout 4, if you want a maxed out character, you're going to have to put in some work. It's technically possible, but it's not an easy thing to do. And right when you're picking your special stats, that becomes very apparent because you really can't go crazy with this particular system. And what's more, this is actually more important than you might initially think because your points in these stats where you put them here determines what perks you can pick up later, which means if you want to roll into a particular playstyle, you do actually need to be pretty on point with your perk placement here. Now, generally, it's not a good idea to bring any of these above a 9, that is to say to the maximum of 10, and this is because you'll find bobbleheads that will increase that for you. Now, that's especially noteworthy because most everything else besides those bobbleheads or manually putting a perk point into the stat itself will not actually increase the perk level that you can purchase. So every one of these special stats has a row of perks associated with it. 10 rows to be specific, and you can only access up to the row that stat enables you. So if you have one, you only get to access the first row. Bobbleheads will add to this flat amount, letting you pick up the next row in line. Other bonuses that you get from things like gear or even some of these perks themselves do not do that. They will give you a bonus to that perk that increases its amount in your stats page, but doesn't actually give you access to the next row of perks. So what you choose at the beginning of the game for the special system is important. And while it can be worked around, because again, you can just spend perk points to increase these, that would take a significant perk investment. So you're really better off putting these stat points where you want them at the beginning of the game rather than trying to build up what you don't have later, which is noteworthy. But that brings us to the perks. Every level that we gain a perk. I've already explained a lot of this system, but each perk has several ranks typically, which increases the effects of whatever it is. I've always found these perk trees to be really interesting because of how much they let you do with the game's various systems. You've got your usual stuff like, stealth or increases to various damage types, but then you have much more interesting stuff like the max level strength perk that allows you to charge people while you are inside power armor to deal damage and potentially send them flying. The Idiot Savant perk, which allows you to potentially get like 10 times the XP on any increase of it, basically, and then you'll get even more for kills for a set period of time. And in fact, once in my previous playthroughs of this game, when I 100% it years ago, was when I was completing the main quest. That particular quest, unsurprisingly, gives you a crap ton of experience points, and I actually got Idiot Savant to trigger on that quest, which wound up giving me, I think it was like 12,000 experience points. It was nonsense. And then there's all the perks that allow you to flesh out your settlement, which we'll get into, but this lets you create supply lines and use them in interesting ways and even set them up into like full little towns yourself that you'll completely build up. There are perks that let you pacify enemies mid-combat, like with the robots, or charisma perks that let you do this to animals or humans. And because of all those different choices, you really can build a whole host of just unique different characters, and I can see why they ultimately went with this particular type of gameplay. Now, one thing I don't love about the perk tree so much, though, is that that there are way too many crafting perks. A big part of progression comes from potentially crafting it yourself, otherwise you're dealing with random drops that you may or may not find. You can fully mod out your weapons and even armor in this game, provided you have the perks to do so. I think there's a few too many of these perks overall, and as a result requires a huge investment if you actually want to go that route, but being able to fully mod out your guns and armor and everything without having to rely on the drops you find is hugely beneficial for any character. But as a result, the gear that your character has is a huge part of progression as well, and that takes advantage, I would say, of Fallout 4's layered armored system. So Fallout 4 has a system of armor in which you don't just equip general armor pieces, but rather each potential armor piece takes up a whole host of different slots, sometimes all at once, sometimes individually. So your character can wear a suit of clothing under everything else, basically. This can be like a vault jumpsuit or a combat uniform from the Brotherhood of Steel or something, and then on top of that you can put armor pieces. This can be an entire suit of armor, that is to say an entire set that covers all of your limbs and your torso, or you can find armor pieces that cover each of those areas individually to create armor for your entire character. And overall, I enjoy that layered armor system, especially in combination with all the crafting that allows you to customize individual components of it really, really well. Now when it comes to items though, I have to mention the legendary system and legendary enemies, of course. So as you make your way across the wasteland, you'll almost certainly encounter some legendary enemies at some point, and these are different for a few reasons. For starters, they will mutate when they get down to half health, provided you don't one-shot them. This will refill their health and also buff them, but when they die, they'll drop a legendary piece. This is a piece of equipment with an extra special effect. Not all of these are made equal. In fact, some are way, way better than others. In fact, as an example, towards the end of this run, when I was in the Nuka World DLC, I found a 2-shot plasma rifle, which effectively doubles its damage output, which is an incredible find. That's one of the better weapon ones you can find on any given piece of equipment, that is to say 2-shot. Now the catch is, these effects, be they on armor or weapons, are typically the same effects you'll see on unique items that you get given for quest rewards and stuff, which means it is technically possible to find duplicates of those items, which makes them feel a little less unique. Though, truth be told, that has happened to me very few times across hundreds of hours with this game, so while you'll see people bring that up as like a counterpoint to the system, I really don't think it comes up enough to be a huge issue. Most unique items still feel really unique, but yes, it is technically possible to find duplicates this way. I'm actually a pretty big fan of the legendary system just because it makes otherwise meaningless equipment potentially more interesting, like when I picked up that 2-shot plasma rifle. That could have just been another junk plasma rifle, but because it dropped off a legendary enemy with that 2-shot mechanic, I suddenly had a huge upgrade that I used for the rest of that playthrough. And that doesn't even discount the crazy stuff you can get, like the explosive minigun that can occasionally happen. But all of those things are going to contribute to progression, and while it may not exactly be traditional Fallout, it is a lot of fun. And I do think it fits the game they built here, which is why I'm largely okay with it. Now, the last thing I want to mention before we move on from progression, though, is the max level of Fallout 4, because this is honestly just a little side note that I think is really funny, because Fallout 4 has what you could call a practical maximum and then the actual maximum. Now, typically speaking, in a playthrough where you see basically all of the content, you're likely going to end the game around level 65 to 80, depending on what you did or, whether or not you did the DLCs and everything. But if you're thorough, probably right around there. That's a very strong character. You've hit most of the game and its content at that point, but you can go much, much higher. Now, level 300 is the practical maximum. This is where you will have every perk and every stat maxed out. You're not going to get to this without grinding, assuming you don't just use console commands or something. You see, but then there's the very fun fact of the game's actual maximum level, and that number is 65,535. And technically it can go higher, but your game will crash after that. And the reason for this is because that's the maximum number your level can be that can actually be stored in your save file. Anything past that, when the game tries to load, it will just crash because it can't load that, as the value overflows from the hex, which is maybe a little too technical for people, but it'll crash your game, basically. All of that, though, brings us to the gameplay and world sections. So, Fallout 4 and the Commonwealth here are, I think, one of Bethesda's best sandboxes sandboxes. It's really fun to explore. They nailed the atmosphere. Places like the glowing sea are incredible. And because of all those complications with the main story I mentioned, I really think some of their best material is in the side content anyway, and exploring any of these individual areas that can give you more information about what happened there in pre-war America or all of these other things. So because of that, gameplay-wise, I really do think Fallout 4 is fantastic, especially because you get to run around this sandbox, which is really, really well done. Not least of which because of how it embraces verticality, which is, truth be told, something Bethesda's sort of middle area of games kind of stopped letting you do, like Oblivion and Skyrim. It's only more recently, with games like Fallout 4 a little bit, and then Starfield, where we're seeing them kind of get okay with just letting players do that again, from games like Morrowind, where you were free to just levitate across the map if you wanted. But the Commonwealth is made up of a few different areas, but the dense ruins of Boston are a big part of that, and you have all these skyscrapers and falling apart interstate lines, and you can get up on those. You get a jetpack at one point. You can sort of fly around individual areas if you want. And while you can't do it right away, you will get to a point where you can absolutely deal with getting up on top of those things, which can often hide just like little collectibles and chests and stuff from you. So the exploration of both those city areas and the individual portions of the map that are much more desolated, like the glowing sea, is some really compelling stuff, and that's before you even start talking about the settlements. But the first thing I really want to mention right here is how level scaling in Fallout 4 works. Now, if you know anything about Bethesda's history, Oblivion's level scaling was really, really bad, and they largely fixed that in Skyrim, and then Fallout 4 does it pretty well also. And while you can certainly abuse it a little if you know how it works, chances are, to the average player moving through, you'll probably likely not even really notice it. But the way it works is that effectively each zone that you walk into outside of where you start the game in Sanctuary Hills has a level range associated with it. That is to say, a minimum enemies in that area will be, and then a maximum they will be. That applies to most enemies. This effectively means that whenever you walk into that area locks at that particular level in relation to your character level, that is, and it's like that for the rest of the game. Now, this means if I go into a high-level area at a low level, let's say level 1 for ease's sake, that area is going to lock itself in at the lowest level of that range. Meaning that when I go there, those enemies will still be higher than me while I'm level 1, but I will eventually be able to outpace and outlevel them, creating that sort of satisfying feeling of going from a nobody to somebody just decimating everything you see. So while you can certainly abuse that a little bit once you know how it works, for the most part it's a much better system than some of their previous games. Now, where it gets a little bit tricky though is leveled enemies. Not every enemy actually adheres to that level range of an individual zone. Sometimes you'll spawn in enemies that will scale with your character's level all the way right up to 65,535. Those enemies, as a result, are certainly a little more dangerous, but they tend to be fewer and far between in comparison to the regular enemies that do not scale. So what you've really got to watch out for is enemies that are set in stone, that is to say, no matter when or where you go, that character will always be a certain level, and then the enemies that scale with you infinitely. So at the very least, something to be aware of as you're moving about the wasteland. Now, the other stuff I want to talk about here, besides just the ins and outs of how that works, is the more atmosphere-based stuff. I love how the Institute is presented as this sort of thing that goes bump in the night, where they're kidnapping people and replacing them with synths. You see paranoia everywhere in basically every settlement you go to. And the best part is that's backed up by the fact that some of these people are actually synths. There's not a ton of them, but some of the NPCs in the game have legitimately been replaced by synths, and I think that's really cool. I mentioned earlier how the Minutemen has actually been infiltrated already. And the only way you're going to find that out is by killing those characters and collecting a synth component off of their body. So the moment you find that out naturally, provided you don't just look it up, can be this really impactful moment where because something happened, you just accidentally learned someone was actually a synth or something to that effect, which is a really great time, especially when you couple it with the more impactful side quests the game has, which there aren't a ton of, truth be told, because so much of it is tied up in the main story, but there is some really cool stuff in there, like the Vault 81 quest I mentioned with saving that kid's life or not, siding with the robots or the scavengers as part of the USS Constitution, 1, which presents some of the game's only skill checks, which are incredibly few and far between, which is one of the things that I think is lacking, even if they do occasionally come up. But then there's stuff that doesn't really have a quest associated with it at all, like exploring Dunwich Borers and the usual sort of Cthulhu mythos vibe stuff they've got going on there that permeates a lot of their games. And exploring all of that and seeing all this environmental storytelling is really Bethesda at some of its best work. Some of that stuff is just really, really good, especially when you're going through some ruin and you pick up a holotape and you hear this like haunting retelling of that person's experience as the bombs were dropping. And again, the voice acting there is pretty much without fail incredibly on point, to the tune of me being able to remember word for word some of those holotapes to this day. And that makes exploration around these areas and learning about all this stuff incredibly satisfying, especially when you combine it with the progression loop that the game normally has of doing all this stuff, taking all these resources back to whatever hub you're working out of, turning that into more progression via items, more settlements, etc., and then getting back out there to explore more of this place. But there's a few things I want to hone in on there in particular. For starters, companions. This is one of Bethesda's first games where they made more of an effort with companions to be more than just simple face value things. They're still a little light on content, mind you, but there are multiple companions that can be romanced. They all pretty much have their own individual quests. So while they're not as fully fleshed out as a game that really takes the time to dig into companions specifically, they are honestly pretty good. Now that said, most of the best ones are tied to the main story in some way, like Nick Valentine or Piper. They unsurprisingly get a bit more reactivity that makes them feel a bit more alive as a result, but for the most part, I think they did a pretty good job with this. Now I don't want to go into them all individually because frankly there's a lot of them. But if you hang out with these guys enough and raise their affinity to its maximum, you'll get a perk alongside a unique quest that you wouldn't see otherwise. One of my personal favorites is taking the robot Curie that you find during the Vault 81 quest and then giving her an actual body so she can live on. Another great one is curing Kate of her psycho addiction, which all makes for some really compelling content. And it was definitely a big step up for companions with Bethesda at that time, for sure, even if they still are a little bit shallow in comparison to some other titles. But then we've got power armor and settlements. So power armor plays a pretty big role in Fallout 4, largely because it's the easiest way to get around some places, especially when you get that jetpack upgrade, but it functions much differently than their previous games in the sense that it's actually like a suit of armor that you get into, as opposed to just items you equip. This means that you have to keep these items repaired. In fact, the repair system has largely been trimmed down to just your power armor, but while you're wearing it about and running around, it will take damage and you'll have to repair it if you want to keep using it. It also runs off of fusion cores, which are pretty abundant. And the nice thing about it is that a full suit of power armor will protect you from radiation and even fall damage. And there's even builds and perks that lean fully into this. Now, I've seen some people complain that Fallout 4 gives you power armor right away, but for what it's worth, it gives you like the worst version of the power armor. It's rusty, it's beaten down, you're likely not going to have the fusion cores to keep it running at that time, but it does kind of exemplify a problem that you see with Bethesda sometimes, at least in this era, where they set up these really cool moments and then it's kind of at the detriment of other parts of the game. But in this case, I don't really think that's the case, because while you do get power armor pretty early, it's only like incredibly good if you really lean into it. But that's the case with pretty much everything in Fallout 4. So that said, it does have some huge benefits just generally, and at the very least, I like to take a full set into the glowing sea, even when I'm on characters that don't use power armor much, and that's because of the protection from radiation it provides. But now, finally, let's talk about settlements before we move on. A big feature of Fallout 4 is the ability to build settlements, effectively your own towns. There are a lot of these. Many locations, when you've cleared them out, you can find a workshop there. Interacting with this workshop allows you to build in that immediate vicinity, basically to where you can find a green barrier. The starting area of the game, Sanctuary Hills, is typically my main base that I like to make, but you'll find these everywhere. The Minutemen typically send you to various settlements to get them up and running, and you can lean into this, as I mentioned, with perks that allow you to turn this into like a whole living, breathing community that you can build up if you want. Now, you don't have to interact with basically any of this outside of a few quests in the main story that require it. Otherwise, you can build and change things to your heart's content, and you'll even get experience for doing so, which can level you up, and in fact, some experience exploits take advantage of exactly that. Now, DLC added on to this tremendously, letting you do things like set up little factories. Vault 88 allows you to perform experiments on potential settlers, which was honestly kind of funny, letting you become Vault Tech if you so desire, and even giving you a giant vault to actually make your own. But largely, I would say you'll get out of the settlement building what you put into it. There's some truly crazy stuff you can do with it if you want to put in the time and effort, but I don't usually bother outside of building up one specific town that I then use for the rest of the game. But you can, if you want, set up all these supply lines and whatnot, and turn it into this whole thing if you've got the patience for it. But in order to build any of these settlements, you first have to break down materials, and this is all going to be stored at the workshop that you break these items down at, but you'll also find all sorts of junk all over the map, which has specific components that can be broken down into, which is especially useful for crafting, but you're also going to need that in order to build much of anything. Each workshop, if you don't have supply lines set up, is largely independent as well, meaning each individual settlement has its own inventory that you'll be pulling and putting this stuff into, and occasionally you can even get like shipments of things like that from vendors, etc., that will help you set up and maintain your settlements as a result. Now, this is one of the things that I think makes survival mode work so well, because you have to decide what components to pick up and take with you so you can break them down into useful things, especially if you're going the crafting route. But setting up supplies and building all that stuff is especially important, not least of which since you'll have to maintain your settlements and hopefully keep them happy. This involves doing things like providing actual electricity to them, water of course, a steady food supply, defense, beds to sleep in, the whole nine. And you have the options to do all of that. You can even then, later on, start setting up stores and whatnot to increase their happiness even further, and turn each individual settlement, of which there are tons, into its own little prosperous community. And I think that is a really cool, fleshed out system if you've got the patience to use it to its fullest. I typically only use it to its bare minimum, so there's that, I suppose. Moving on to combat, though. Combat is one of those things where you're going to get out of it what you put into it, because there's a whole host of different ways to play this game, not least of which down to all the different guns and weapons you can use, but also because of the way perks and things like VATs interact, if you want to use VATs at all as an example. So again, your approach is really going to be make or break for you on this front. But generally, Fallout 4 is a really good shooter, surprisingly so. Combat feels a lot better here than it does in many of Bethesda's games. Like I mentioned earlier, you can co-opt robots to help you out. There are perks that will allow you to pacify human and animal enemies. You can just straight up hack robots you find in combat. All sorts of different weapons have all sorts of different effects. In fact, you can often modify exactly how those guns work, and that's to say nothing of the legendary effects. So there's this huge variety of combat that really adds on to the fact that yes, it is technically just a first-person shooter in a lot of ways. And that's before you even get into the melee weapons like the super sledge or the fist weapons. So combat can be this really satisfying thing where you sort of lean into a specific style that you want to focus on and then take that to its logical maximum. Sneaking around with a sniper rifle is as effective as you would imagine, but also you can fully max out the pickpocket perk to allow you to pick enemies' pockets, take their weapons, their armor, and fill those pockets with grenades instead. And with a maxed out stealth stat, you're even pretty good at sneaking just fully in power armor, which is as ridiculous as it sounds. And then there's all the different enemy behaviors you have to learn. So generally speaking, I'm not a huge fan of how they made the ghouls look in Fallout 4, as I think how they looked in previous iterations was probably more realistic, but I imagine as graphics were getting better, that is slowly approaching the point where it's pretty gross. And so they changed it to this slightly more leather skin look. But nonetheless, all of the feral ghouls just sort of rushing at you in a mad dash as they jump and snarl at you is upsetting, honestly. But even that can be mitigated through perks. There's a perk called Ghoulish that will make a lot of feral ghouls just ignore you outright, which can be especially helpful because ghouls also tend to emit radiation, which can happen with other types of enemies as well, and that radiation, of course, eats into your health bar. In this particular entry in the series, which is also a really cool change that I like, as radiation has a more tangible, immediate effect on your character this way, but even that, with that Ghoulish perk, can be turned into healing instead, which will entirely flip that script and how you're playing the game most likely. Now, I will say, though, if you are not playing a completely melee-oriented character, you're probably going to want to watch out in terms of what weapons you're using, because it's easy to run out of ammo in this game, because you're going to go through probably quite a lot of it. So it can be helpful to carry several different guns to assign to your different quick slots via the favorite system in order to switch between guns that use different types of ammo, so you can use it a little more judiciously. Now, while you can play Fallout 4 largely as a first-person shooter if you want. What can get lost in that translation then is the VATS system. So VATS, as I'm sure people are aware, was part of the third game that was an interpretation of aimed shot from the first two titles, which allowed you to aim at specific body parts. With the switch to 3D and the genre shift there, they turned it into VATS, which allows you to slow down and focus on the more RPG elements of your character by aiming at specific body parts. And while that's less of a thing in Fallout 4, VATS is like a full-on build you can lean into. So while 3 largely used the system as a method of bridging the skill gap between, actually having to aim and shoot between the RPG elements of the original 2 games, Fallout 4 leans into it more as a potential play style than anything else. There are perks that enhance this, there are weapons that take more of an advantage of it, meaning that VATS, at least in my opinion, is used more as a play style here than anything else. But the catch is, while it might be easy to ignore VATS in Fallout 4 if you want, it's also an incredibly strong way to play the game. In fact, I would go so far as to say that some of the strongest ways you can play this game rely on using VATS specifically, despite the fact that it's not really necessary. Which I thought was a sort of interesting evolution of that, because it obviously got its start as being something quite different, but has since then turned into essentially just a playstyle. And we even see Obsidian's, that is to say New Vegas's developer, further iterate upon that themselves with the Outer Worlds tactical time dilation, which serves a somewhat similar purpose. And because of that, if we ever see that Fallout 5 in our lifetimes, it'll be interesting to me to see how much more the VAT system grows and if they keep taking it in interesting directions. Because at this point, I would largely say it's turned into something that is beyond what its original intention was, as a solution to a design problem. But moving right along, let's finally talk about DLC now. So Fallout 4 got a lot of DLC. A lot of it wasn't very interesting. It simply expanded the settlement system or the building system, which you may or may not enjoy. And the fact that they sold that for money is crazy, but there are 4 DLC in particular I want to talk about because they add content to the game that you can experience. Starting with the easiest of them, which is Vault 88. This adds a vault that you can claim as your own and build into whatever you want. It's effectively your own vault to use as you please, and it also at the same time gives you a bunch of abilities and options to perform your own tests and things on the people that settle in the vault, allowing you to become your own little mini version of Vault Tech, which is always fun. There's some quests associated with this that teach you how to use everything. Relatively small DLC, but it's fun for its niche. Then there are the other 3 more content-related ones, which are Automatron, Nuka World, and Far Harbor. Automatron is a relatively small DLC that I personally like a lot because it gave you the ability to build robots that could then be customized and turned into whatever you want. It also comes with a short quest line to investigate the resurgence of the Mechanist from Fallout 3, which is going to see you fighting all sorts of new robot enemies on top of a new raider gang called the Rust Devils. Again, not a huge DLC, but I've always really enjoyed it because of what it added to the game in terms of gameplay elements. But then we have the 2 big ones, Nuka World and Far Harbor. We'll start with Nuka World, because Nuka World is like an expansion of the main game in every sense. The main story of it, kinda silly. Doesn't always make a ton of sense. The actual gameplay that it enables and the content therein, lot of fun. Basically, you investigate some raiders at a transit station to a theme park known as Nuka World. You then go there only to learn that they've been taken over by raiders, it would seem, and you have to run this gauntlet before fighting their boss to become the new overboss of the raiders. At this point, they ask you to take over the park since their old boss got a little too lazy resting on his laurels for their taste, and they want somebody to subdue the rest of the theme park so they can make use of it and start striking back at the Commonwealth. This DLC allows you to become a full-on raider if you want, implementing raider settlements in the Commonwealth once you get that far, and each individual area of the theme park has its own theme and zones that you'll have to deal with and solve a quest in order to claim that territory. Now, as you're doing all of this, you are literally claiming territory and assigning it to one of the 3 gangs there. Whichever gang has the least amount of territory at the end turns on you and you have to kill their leader, which is honestly kind of silly, but I suppose raiders were never exactly the brightest bulbs to begin with, so maybe that's not a big surprise. A lot of the raiders in this one are kind of hard to take seriously, but it does have some great quests, like allowing Sierra Petrovita to meet with the frozen head of Mr. Brad Burton, the creator of Nuka-Cola, which is why Nuka World exists to begin with, and you can kind of learn how he got in his current state, which is fun. So Nuka World for me was a ton of fun in terms of content. There's a lot of great quests in there, just to do with the theme park and stuff, but the overall story is lacking, to say the least. It's also worth a mention that after you take the theme park and right before that gang leader turns on you, you have to complete a quest called Home Sweet Home, which might be one of the worst implemented quests I've ever seen in a game, as it forces you to go back and forth between the Nuka World and Commonwealth map like 5 different times, all while you try to make this new raider settlement happy, and it just sucks. It's not hard, it's just incredibly tedious and annoying. And what's more, completing it will actually turn Preston Garvey of the Minutemen against you, which may or may not cause you problems with the main story, which isn't terrible, you know. I've talked about consequences this whole time, and you can in fact become a raider and deal with the consequences of that raiding, but even this is only done in a half measure and probably the most annoying way possible. So put all that together, Nuka World has some really cool quests, I love the theme park idea, but it suffers from the same story problems the main game has. But then we have Far Harbor. Far Harbor is one of Bethesda's best DLC, and it really is a fantastic time. You take everything from the base game, side content that worked, all of these different factions and how they interact with each other, but then you make that have actual meaningful consequences, while at the same time introducing some incredible enemy types and some wonderful atmosphere, and you've got a recipe for a fantastic DLC. A DLC that actually proves that you can do a choice and consequence-based narrative within the framework of this that works perfectly well. But Far Harbor starts by you investigating a disappearance from the Nakano residence. Their daughter, Kasumi, ran away. You find out that she thinks she's a synth and ran off to a synth refuge on the island of Far Harbor. You need to go there and get her back, but this leads you to a conflict between 3 different factions on the island. The people of the town of Far Harbor, the synths of Acadia, and the children of Adam from the Nucleus, each of which have been on the island for various amounts of time, and there's a huge kind of complex narrative caught up with in here. The children of Adam worship this radioactive fog that has largely blanketed the island and has caused monsters to overwhelm it. The islanders at the town of Far Harbor are using the synth's technology, the fog condensers, to keep that fog at bay so they don't all die to these terrifying radiation monsters. One of my favorite of the entire game actually is the hermit crab enemies that were introduced here, which are these gigantic hermit crabs taking up residence in cars that are absolutely terrifying the first time you run into them, and that's to say nothing of the fog crawlers or the gulpers, and it's some really great stuff. But it gets even better when you find out that Dima, the synth leading Acadia, is actually one of the same prototypes that Nick Valentine was, and they are effectively brothers as much as synths can be, and there's a whole host of dialogue associated with that. But then it gets even more complicated when you find out that Dima has been covering up a huge, let's say, contingency plan of his that threatens the destruction of everything he's built as well as the other factions, and you get in the middle of that and have to decide the fate of essentially everyone involved, leading to multiple different endings that can see everyone dying or a best outcome that is ultimately morally gray. There's really not a right answer here so much as just shades of doing the best you can, assuming you don't just want to kill everybody, I guess, which is also an option. In fact, the very first time I played this DLC, right when it launched, I came across the children of Adam, who are at the Nucleus, and technically you can go in there and quest for them and stuff. But the thing is, when I first played this, the children of Adam in the base game are largely a hostile faction. There are a couple that won't shoot at you in the glowing sea, but for the most part, when you run into them, they're out for your blood. So when I stumbled across the Children of Adam, I just started blasting. And it wasn't until I got inside the Nucleus and saw all these main characters that I realized my mistake. So all in all, Far Harbor is this great narrative set in a really cool place, with all these different outcomes that is set up in a way that allows you to just pick a side and stick with it, as opposed to not letting you commit to a particular path, short of just killing absolutely everyone full murder hobo style. But like I said, Far Harbor is genuinely one of Bethesda's best DLCs out there, and I would go so far as to say it's probably the best part of Fallout 4, especially because it takes a lot of the concepts from the base game and actually turns them into what I would have liked to have seen the base game do in a lot of ways. Although, to be fair, it does have probably one of the most bizarre little mini-games I've ever seen in a game that is required to mess around with in order to get some of those endings to begin with, as you need to unlock some memories from Dima. So I wouldn't say it's perfect per se, it does have its odd moments, but otherwise it's a really great time. Though that does bring us to the Steam Deck section for Fallout 4, which is probably most relevant given the recent next-gen update. But that said, Fallout 4 is verified on the Steam Deck, and it actually runs very, very well. In fact, they even put out an update. You see, I believe as part of the next-gen update, actually, they removed the launcher that pops up as part of the regular PC experience for Fallout 4 on the Steam Deck. So if you're running it on the Steam Deck, that won't pop up at all. and it'll just run straight into the game. Now that's mostly a good thing, but it's worth mentioning that with Fallout 4, where you change the graphic settings is actually in that launcher, so that can be a little annoying if you want to change anything in particular, though the default layout, or setup if you will, should be pretty good to go. You may only get like 40 FPS generally, and you may have to tweak some settings if you're like absolutely determined to get 60 FPS, but even that should be possible if you're willing to mess around with some of those settings, which you can find some guides for online if you really want to mess around with. But even out of the gate, it should run very well on the Steam Deck, but you really shouldn't have too much trouble with it otherwise, which does finally bring us to our positives and negatives. So the positives of Fallout 4 for me are largely the sandbox, the exploration, the general gameplay. All of that stuff is great. Fallout 4 is a game that is fun to like actually play through. Doing all of these things individually is a fun time. Exploring these ruins and then finding all this stuff and information about what was here before and what happened before you've ever gotten here hundreds of years ago really is some of Bethesda's best environmental storytelling. And being able to do that in a way that is largely free-form and allows you to move very vertically even across an interesting map with a character system that allows you to deal with all these different playstyles if you want is a ton of fun. Now, like a lot of people, where Fallout 4 falls short for me is in fact the main story and how it is seemingly intent on you not missing out on anything even when you are clearly trying to lock yourself into a path. It's a game that doesn't seem to want to let you commit to a choice short of murdering everyone until right at the end, and then even when you do, all of that stuff coalesces into more or less the same endings anyway. And while some of those endings will certainly have impacts on Fallout 5 from a narrative standpoint, they have basically no difference at all in this game. And what I mean by that is like the quests and even like the end cutscene are exactly the same, which is bizarre. And then when you couple that stuff with the reduction of RPG elements, like for instance skill checks probably being one of the easiest ones, there are very few proper skill checks in the game, which is a side effect of them going for this more perk-oriented system. And while I enjoy that system for what it is, that comes with a trade-off to the RPG elements that I, truth be told, prefer more. So when you put all of that together for a conclusion, Fallout 4 is, as I mentioned at the beginning, a game of high highs and low lows. There are parts of this game that I love. It has these incredible, like almost cinematic moments where this big cool thing happens and you get to be part of it. And then just the moment-to-moment exploring tends to be great. And then you'll go have a conversation with an NPC where you basically betray them to their face and they're like, that's fine. And yet these people are supposed to be like zealots representing their faction half the time. And that makes for some certainly uneven writing, which is where I think the lows come in. So I would say it's interesting to have a game swing so heavily between stuff I think is really cool to things I think aren't done well at all. And that's kind of what Fallout 4 is to me. Now, given that it released in 2015, and I would say most likely people already know how they feel about Fallout 4, I'll spare you the recommendation and simply say that for the most part, I have a really good time with Fallout 4 for what it is. It has some fantastic moments even. It's just a shame then that I think Fallout 4 never quite lives up to what it could be, or could have been, I suppose might be more accurate. But some frustrations with the narrative aside, it's still largely a really fun and enjoyable game. But that, I think, is pretty much everything I've got to say about Fallout 4. I hope you enjoyed it. It was fun for me, at the very least, to go back to a game that I started making content on and sort of update that alongside the game itself's updates so I could close another little mini chapter of my own. That is pretty much going to do it for today. By all means, let me know all about how you feel about this one down in the comment section below, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.